No matter where you live, whether it's a town or in the country, chances are you don't live too far from a churchyard or a cemetery. Have you ever just wandered around and read some of the headstones and wondered what kind of life these people had, or wondered how they died? If you look closely, you may find one that has a curious epitaph written upon it, or a couple of words that may seem curious and hint to something intriguing. In this series, I'll be bringing you stories behind these headstones to reveal an interesting life or a tragic and sorrowful end. These are not celebrities as we know today. Some may have been recognised in their lifetime but are forgotten names now, or they may be normal folk whose lives were tragically cut short. Join me as I discover some tales from the grave. Today we are at St John's Church, Bromsgrove, to visit an unusual grave to two men. The epitaph reads, "Sacred to the memory of Thomas Scaife, late an engineer on the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway, who lost his life at Bromsgrove Station by the explosion of an engine boiler on Tuesday the 10th of November 1840. He was 28 years of age, highly esteemed by his fellow workmen for his many amiable qualities, and his death will long be lamented by all those who had the pleasure of his acquaintance." The following lines were composed by an unknown friend as a memento of the worthiness of the deceased. "My engine now is cold and still, no water does my boiler fill. My coke affords its flame no more, my days of usefulness are o'er. My wheels deny their noted speed, no more my guiding hands they heed. My whistle too has lost its tone, its shrill and thrilling sounds are gone. My valves are now thrown open wide, my flanges all refuse to guide. My clacks also, though once so strong, refuse to aid the busy throng. No more I feel each urging breath, my steam is now condensed in death. Life's railway o'er each station's past, in death I'm stopped and rest at last. Farewell, dear friends, and cease to weep. In Christ I'm safe, in him I sleep." This tone was erected at the joint expense of his fellow workman, 1842. The adjoining headstone reads, "Sacred to the memory of Joseph Rutherford, late engineer to the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway Company, who died November the 11th, 1840, aged 32 years. O reader, stay and cast an eye upon this grave wherein I lie. For cruel death has challenged me, and soon, alas, will call on thee. Repent in time, make no delay, for Christ will call you all away. My time was spent like day in sun, beyond all cure my glass is run." This stone was erected by his affectionate widow, 1841. Thomas Scaife, 23, and Joseph Rutherford, 32, were two unfortunate employees of the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway who tragically lost their lives when the boiler on a steam locomotive exploded at Bromsgrove on the 10th of November 1840. A craftsman was commissioned to produce the impressive gravestones. Unfortunately, he drew a 420 locomotive built by Norris rather than the correct locomotive, which was a 220 named Surprise, something that no doubt today would have resulted in a libel action. Scaife was killed instantly, but Rutherford died the following day. The Railway magazine of October 1951 reported that Scaife's gravestone had been damaged by vandals on the 2nd of March 1951. The memorial broke off at the base and ended up in 3 pieces. Bromsgrove District Council paid £17, 10 shillings and 6pence to join the 3 sections with concrete supports and bronze clips. Note that when the grave was restored, the first line of text that originally correctly read as Birmingham and Gloucester Railway has been changed to the non-existent Birmingham and Worcester Railway. The locomotive that blew up was apparently a one-off locomotive built by a Dr. William Church of Birmingham, the boiler being built by Mr. Horton of Briley Hill. The engine, which was named Surprise, was owned by Mr. S. A. Goddard and was at Bromsgrove for trials. A report from the Worcestershire Chronicle dated Wednesday 11th of November 1840 reads, Bromsgrove frightful accident. About 6 o'clock last evening, as a new steam engine, said to be on principles recommended by Dr. Church of Birmingham, was being tried in the ascent of the inclined plane near this place, the boiler burst with a terrific explosion. One man named Scaife, the engine driver we believe, was killed on the spot, and several others were much scalded, one of them dangerously. Had a train been attached to the engine, the consequences might have been most disastrous. Surely government in the next session of Parliament will propose the enactment of some stringent regulations to be observed by railway companies with a view of obviating the fatal accidents which have late been continually occurring. The surprise was a well-tanked locomotive designed by American inventor Dr. William Church. He is best known for his typesetting machine, but experimented with steam engines and invented an expanding mandrel for fixing boiler tubes. The surprise was the first tank engine to be fitted with a multi-tube boiler. The engine was originally named Victoria and employed from 1838 as a ballast engine on the London and Birmingham Railway. It was reputed to have achieved a speed of 60 miles per hour. It was also used on the Grand Junction Railway before being offered for sale to the Birmingham and Gloucester Company. After the November 1840 explosion, the engine was refitted, renamed Eclipse, and put back into service on the London and Birmingham Railway. By the late 1850s, it had again been rebuilt and was in use on the Swansea Vale Railway. William Crews, the locomotive superintendent at Bromsgrove, had earlier complained about contamination of the water supply at Bromsgrove. However, the evidence that an accumulation of sand in the boiler was a contributory factor in the explosion seems to have been disregarded by the jury. The 1841 census finds Rutherford's widow Hannah, aged 30, still residing at Bromsgrove Station with 2 children, William, aged 4, and Catherine, aged 2 years, although the inquest report suggests the Rutherfords had 3 children. Efforts to trace the background of both Scaife and Rutherford have been largely fruitless. An article from the Worcestershire Chronicle dated Wednesday 18th of November 1840 gives more details on the accident. Dreadful accident on the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway, 2 lives lost. We narrated in our last report such brief particulars of the accident at the Bromsgrove station on this railway as we could at so short a notice. We were in error in stating that the engine was being tried in the ascent of the inclined plane, the fact being that it was just preparing to start on the ascent of the inclined plane when the explosion took place. The engine belonged to Mr. S.A. Goddard of Birmingham and was built by Dr. Church of that place. It appears to have been in the possession of the company for trial only, and if approved was to have been purchased. Besides the engineer Thomas Scaife, another servant of the company named John Rutherford has fallen a victim to the explosion. The latter was about 40 years of age and had a wife and 3 small children, the eldest of them not being older than 6 years. He was almost idolised by the men under him, and his employers thought extremely high of him. Scaife was a single man and much respected in his walk of life. On Thursday, R. Docker Esquire, one of the county coroners, held an inquest on the bodies at the residence of George Ellins Esquire. After a brief explanation of the object of them being assembled by the coroner, the jury proceeded to examine the engine and afterwards viewed the 2 bodies. Rutherford's was lying at his house near the station, and Scaife's remains were laid out in a room in the Dragoon public house adjoining the station. The following evidence was then taken. John Henshaw, an engineer in the employ of Mr. S.A. Goddard of Birmingham, deposed to making certain alterations in the locomotive to which the accident happened, in order to cause it to generate more steam. These alterations were not in the least calculated to affect the security of the engine, and the whole of the alterations were approved of by Dr. Church, the original builder of the engine. When it was completed, the witness tried the engine after screwing the safety valves down to 55 or 60 pounds of pressure to the circular inch. The witness proceeded as follows. After I had made these improvements, Mr. Goddard directed me to go to Bromsgrove to see whether the Gloucester and Birmingham Company were disposed to come and inspect it, as he understood that if they approved of it, they would purchase it off him. I there saw Mr. Burgess, Mr. Cruse and Mr. Rutherford, the deceased, and the two latter came to my yard and examined the engine, of which they expressed their approval, and it was in consequence brought upon the line on Monday morning last. Almost immediately after its arrival at Bromsgrove, experimental trips were proposed, and I commenced filling the boiler from the pipe on the line. I said the water was not fit to put in the boiler, as it was very dirty and full of grit and sand, and I suggested that it ought to be filtered, in which Rutherford, who was then with me, agreed. On Monday, before starting, I screwed down the valves to 44 pounds of pressure to the circular inch, and went away at that, and the steam blew away uncommonly well. On Tuesday, an afternoon trip was made between 3 and 4 o'clock, at which time Rutherford, a Scaife and others went with me, and the valve was set between 44 and 45, the same as the day before. We ran at the rate of 18 miles an hour and travelled almost 7 miles. Rutherford then proposed that we should take the engine up the inclined plane and push a company's engine before us. This proposition, as regards the company's engine, was because I did not like to venture up the plane, as I had no brakes upon my engine. While we were preparing to start, we looked at the gauge to see how full the engine was of water, and found that it was 3 parts full and all right. The valve was blowing steam a little, and Rutherford, Paul, Scaife, Jennings, myself and another or two were upon the engine. The fire did not burn well, and Scaife went down to the fire hole and did something to the fire with the fire hook. Rutherford stood next to the witness, rather over the firebox, who was in the place usually occupied by the driver of the engine, and Jennings was in the corner. We were just ready to start. The firebox is round and has water surrounding it. At this moment the bottom of the plate containing the water burst and threw me about 6 yards from when the engine originally stood, though it had, by the force of the explosion, recoiled some distance. I was insensible for some seconds, and when I came to myself I saw Paul streaming with blood, and upon asking where Scaife was, someone said he was killed, but I could not learn what had become of Rutherford, or if anyone told me, I do not remember it. I was very much scalded and bruised about my neck and back, and the fireman, Paul, was dangerously wounded, with scalds, cuts and bruises. Bishop examined the valves, and Mr. Cruse said no plane could attach to me, as they were not screwed down to more than 41.5 pounds. The upper inner plate of the water case I afterwards ascertained to have burst, and the 2 sides bulged up. The aperture formed by which was about 2 feet long by 12 inches wide. The front casing of the boiler, in consequence of the rush of water through the fireplace, was ripped open and forced upwards. The rush of water and steam of the chimney blew it away, and the domes were also lifted off their places, and the furnace door and cover were thrown off. No other portion of the machinery was injured. The engine was standing still at the time of the accident. The boiler was about 3/8 thick on an average, but in the place where it burst it was not much more than 1/4 of an inch in thickness. I have seen a boiler good and work well of 5/6 of an inch in thickness. The usual average pressure in Birmingham was from 60 pounds to 70 pounds per inch, and the witness said he did not consider the engine, if made of good metal, at all dangerous at a pressure of more than 60 pounds. The explosion was, in his opinion, caused by the sediment contained in the boiler having got against the side of the boiler where it was weakest, and preventing the water from acting against the plate of the boiler. The sediment, he meant, was caused by the sand in the water from the pump and by some plugs, etc., which had been left in the boiler by the maker. Mr. Whately, solicitor of Birmingham, who appeared on behalf of the company, here questioned the witness, who said he had twice filled the boiler and twice the tender out of the pump at the station. He considered the water foul, and that it formed a concrete mass against the side of the boiler. Re-examined by the coroner, the witness stated he was completely smothered in sand as well as water. His trousers, coat and even his hair was covered with it. The front of the boiler, in the part where the fracture occurred, was very bad, and he should not have liked to have trusted it if he had known that it had been so bad or so thin. Mr. G.D. Bishop, an engineer on the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway, was at Bromsgrove Station on Tuesday afternoon. This witness collaborated Henshaw as to state the pressure, £45, denoted on the safety valve, and that the pressure was a very safe one and rather under the usual pressure of railway engines. The witness then continued to describe having heard the explosion and what he saw on making his way to the spot. The witness examined the engine and found 2 of the brass rails broken off, the fire door blown away, the casing in front of the boiler had been ripped out. The outer plate of the boiler was ripped open about 3 feet, measuring it circularly. The iron was not very bad, but it was brittle in its nature. Questioned by Mr. Waitley, the witness said he thought the whole blame was attached to the boilermaker. All the plates of the boiler which could be examined were 1/4 of an inch thick, but the part which burst and could not be conveniently examined was much thinner than any other part. William Taylor, engineer of Dodderhill, had examined the boiler of the steam engine and found it ripped up in the lower part of the inner tube, about 2 feet. He examined the plates and found them 3/16 of an inch thick, which, in his opinion, was not a proper thickness. He was decidedly of the opinion that the cause of the accident was the thinness of the plates. The accumulation of sand spoken of was just impossible. If the engine had been in constant work without cleaning out for a year or 2, but the shortness of time since this one was cleaned rendered such a thing unlikely, if not impossible. From the appearance of the iron, he should say that it was not heated in the manner spoken of by the witness, Henshaw, at the time of the explosion. He also stated that Rutherford spoke in terms of praise of the engine just before the explosion. Mr. George Horton, surgeon of Bromsgrove, saw the body of the deceased Scaife half an hour after the accident, but he saw Rutherford before that time at his house. Scaife's remains were lying at the Dragoon public house upon a table, and he was quite dead and stiff. The skull was dreadfully fractured. One of the eyes, the right, had been torn out. Several pieces of the scalp were scooped out, with fractures of the left thigh, scalds on his legs, arms, hands, face, and other injuries. The injury upon the head alone was sufficient to cause instantaneous death. When the witness saw Rutherford, he was alive and in bed, but dreadfully scalded on his arms, legs, body, face, etc. The skin was almost all off his arms and legs. Rutherford had none of his limbs fractured, and the explosion caused such a shock of the whole frame that reaction never took place, nor did he again get warm. Rum was administered to him, but without avail, as the deceased expired about 8:15 the following morning. Mr. William Crews, chief engineer of locomotives at Bromsgrove Station, deposed that he received instructions from the directors of the railway to receive the engine at the Bromsgrove Station and to try its powers, but he was not acquainted with the object of such experiments. He said that it was a practice on this line never to allow an engine to begin work until after repeated and severely testing trials. The witness entirely dissented from the opinion Henshaw expressed in his evidence of the concretion of sand causing the accident. He attributed the accident to the thinness of the plates and its being destitute of stays, which ought to have been at intervals of 8 or 9 inches. The inquest was here adjourned till the following day at the Golden Cross in Bromsgrove at 6:30, at which time it was resumed. Mr. Waitley called Mr. Crews, who on examination said, "Since my last examination I have broken a portion of the boiler plate off, situated in the fore part of the boiler near to where the explosion took place. I now produce it. It measures full 3/16 of an inch. The thickest part of the boiler plate measured 5/16. I think that if the boiler had been made of the usual thickness, it would have been sufficiently strong, and that the accident might not have occurred." The next witness called was Dr. Church of Birmingham, who was examined by the coroner. He said, "This engine was built under my direction about 3 years ago. There is a difference in the construction of this boiler to the generality of boilers which may be termed different in principles. It consists in the form of the fire bars and position of the tubes, and thereby made stronger. It would require a boiler of less thickness than is usually used, particularly in the brass part. I gave Mr. Joshua Horton of West Bromwich, the maker of this boiler, directions to make the inner tube 3/8 of an inch thick, which is the tube that is burst, and the water tube 5/16 thick. I saw the boiler several times during the time it was being made, and I had the most unbound confidence in his making it to my instructions. Dr. Church now produced the drawings from which the boiler was made, but why they were not examined by the jury did not transpire. I usually prove my engines at 3 times the pressure at which they are calculated to work. This was made to work at a pressure of 50 to the circular inch. I had no suspicion until after the explosion that the inner tube was of the thickness I considered I ordered it to be. I have since ascertained that it was not of that dimension, but only 3/16, being only 1/2. I could not examine with any facility or without considerable expense the accurate thickness of the boiler after it was made, before using it. The engine was first used on the London and Birmingham Railway for several days on trial, experimentally. It was afterwards used on the Grand Junction Railway. But once attached to a train of carriages containing coke at Wolverhampton to Birmingham, it afterwards became unfit for use as the wheels and axle required repair. Other alterations were made in the construction of the engine under the direction of Mr. Goddard, and which I approved of, and when complete it was sent to the Bromsgrove station on the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway. The alterations made would not affect the safety of the boiler, and I am unable to account for the accident except that the boiler was made too thin. If the heat at the time of the accident had been very intense, it would have been visible by the part exploded, assuming a different appearance to what it now does. I think it would have taken a carriage or two up the incline plane with a pressure at 45, but certainly not a heavy train of carriages. It was not calculated for it. Through questioning, it was discovered that the position of the parties at the moment of the fatal explosion was as follows. In front of the furnace or firebox stood Scaife, and immediately behind him was a circular aperture about 2 feet in diameter, made for the purpose of allowing the fireman or stoker to get in and out of the engine. Rutherford was standing at his side, but a little distance from him, and on one side of the firebox with his back near to some brass railings which are placed along the top of the carriage engine at this part. Henshaw and Paul, the stoker, were alongside Rutherford and the witness. Luke and the other persons were near the same place, but further back. Instantaneously upon the explosion, the poor fellow Scaife was blown through the round hole at his back to a distance of 25 yards, where a piece of his scalp with hair adhering to it was picked up, and from that spot to where he was eventually found, a distance of 60 yards. Bits of his clothing, pieces of flesh and clots of blood were found. On inspection by the jury, his remains presented a shapeless, bloody, hideous mass, scarcely recognisable for those of a human being. Rutherford was projected through the brass rails, 3 of which were broken by the force of his body and thrown to many yards. The fireman, Paul, Henshaw and the others were thrown up into the air over the rails in consequence of standing on a higher place than the 2 deceased, and were all injured more or less. But unless Paul, who it is hoped will ultimately recover, should expire, no more lives are likely to be sacrificed in consequence of this sad affair. So terrible was the force of the explosion that the chimney was blown to a distance of 100 yards. The top of the furnace, or lid, a weighty piece of iron, was thrown completely over the station and was found stuck fast in a bank at the back of it, and a spanner or screw wrench was propelled so high into the air that when it fell upon the roof of the station, it passed clean through it and fell through every obstruction to the ground. Worcestershire Chronicle, Wednesday 25th of November 1840. The late fatal explosion on the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway. Adjourned inquest, 3rd day. The adjourned inquest was held at the Golden Cross on Monday last at 11 o'clock, when Mr. Whately appeared as before to watch the case on behalf of the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway Company. Mr. Rawlins of Birmingham on behalf of Mr. Goddard and Dr. Church, and Mr. Fellows Jr. of Dudley on behalf of Mr. Horton. The inquiry did not appear to have lost any of its interest, many of the respectable inhabitants of the town being present. C. Sturge, Esquire, one of the directors of the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway, was also in the room. The court having been opened, Mr. Fellows asked Dr. Church if he adhered to his former statement. The doctor replied that since the last inquiry he had referred to some drawings, by which he found that the plates were ordered to be made only 1/4 of an inch thick, and not 3/8 as he had previously thought. He now thought that the whole of the inner tube must have been ordered to be 1/4 of an inch and not 3/8. He had not had opportunity of testing the other plates, but finding the parts which he did examine correspond with the order, he had no doubt of the fact that they were all made of the thickness ordered. He still thought 1/4 of an inch a safe thickness for a boiler of that diameter. The coroner, at the request of Mr. Fellows, asked the director if he wished to add to or to alter his former evidence in any other particular. Dr. Church replied, "If I have altered it, I am not aware of it." Mr. Fellows asked, "Then you do not wish to add anything further to it?" Dr. Church replied, "Nothing at the present, except as to the cautious manner in which the experiments were made. I was at very great pains to make experiments respecting the strength of the tubes." Mr. Horton, the boiler maker, particularly and earnestly wished the jury to bear in mind that the present thickness of the iron was no proof of what might have been its thickness when it left its yard, and that whether the plate was Dr. Church's or ordered by Mr. Horton of Hunt and Brown, it was 1/4 of an inch in thickness. If they gave this every consideration, they must be satisfied no blame attached to Mr. Horton, because Dr. Church had admitted that he only ordered it to be 4/16 in thickness. Mr. Joshua Horton, boiler-maker of Brierley Hill, was next examined by Mr. Fellows. He stated, "I was employed by Mr. Goddard to make a boiler on Dr. Church's plan. While the boiler was in progress, I think it likely that I communicated with Mr. Goddard about its thickness. I believe it was made of iron of particularly satisfactory quality indeed. I should think it was not heated to such an extent as to weaken the iron. I do not like to give an opinion as to its thickness. If I had said anything about it to Mr. Goddard, it was that it was not strong enough. If I give an opinion at all, I should say that it was not thick enough. I do not consider that thickness safe for a locomotive boiler if it is to work at the pressure that they are generally worked, 60 pounds on the inch. I was of that opinion when I made the boiler. I believe I did communicate that opinion to the person who ordered the boiler. Mr. Goddard had said, 'The doctor is a clever fellow and knows what he is about. It is no business of yours, and you had better proceed with the boiler.' I believe those were his words. I do not know that I am bound to give an opinion respecting the explosion." The coroner intimated that he was bound, as his evidence had been tendered. "Well, sir, I certainly was considering the matter on Saturday evening. The boiler at the time was standing still. It was generating more steam than could escape, and this caused greater pressure than the boiler could stand. This may be correct or incorrect. I cannot tell, because I do not know the size of the valve. Mr. Maund observed that it was in evidence that one safety valve was sufficient." Mr. Rawlins cross-examined Mr. Horton, but nothing particular was brought out. Mr. Fellows then said that he had no other witness to offer on the part of Mr. Horton. James Jennings, one of the men who was on the engine when the explosion took place and who was not yet recovered, was next examined. It was rumoured that the principal object in calling this man was to prove that the safety valve had been tampered with, but it will be seen that his evidence was not decisive upon this point. He said, "I saw the valve at 43 or 44. I never saw her higher than that. The steam was not blowing from both valves, only from the one which the engineer works by. The other was at the back of the chimney, as I could not see it well." Henshaw was speaking to Rutherford about there not being enough steam to go up the incline. I did not hear Rutherford reply. I saw Henshaw at the front dome of the engine, but I cannot say if he was screwing it down or not, because it was getting dark. I do not know what alteration he made. I did not see Rutherford make any memorandum. I do not know who was left on the engine after the explosion. When I came back to the station directly after the explosion, I saw Henshaw calling out, 45, 45. The witness explained that he supposed Henshaw ran about calling out those words to impress upon those who were near that he had been working the steam only up to 45. It being now nearly 5 o'clock, the court was adjourned for an hour. On its being reopened, Mr. Whately called William Woodward, a messenger employed by the railway company, who produced a stone bottle of water from the pump used to supply the boilers with water to prove that it contained no sand. Mr. Whately then proceeded to address the jury on behalf of the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway Company in a very energetic manner, contending that more inquiry was made, the more blameless they would appear. He He then proceeded to show that the company had used every possible precaution before allowing the engine to come onto their line. They had not suffered it to be attached to any of their wagons or carriages, and, in short, had done all that prudence could dictate. Having ridiculed the idea of there having been sand in the boiler, he said that before their engines being used, they were invariably tested to a much higher degree of pressure than could be used on the line. Mr. Whately concluded by strenuously urging the jury to couple with their verdict an expression of opinion that the company was in no ways to blame. Mr. Rawlins next addressed the court at considerable length on behalf of Mr. Goddard and Dr. Church, and concluded by entreating the jury to give merely a nominal fine. The coroner then proceeded to sum up the evidence. Having pointed out what constituted criminal neglect, etc., in the eye of the law, he said that though the engine at the time of the explosion was in the hands of Mr. Goddard's servants, it could only be on the railway by the consent of the company. Therefore, it would be for the jury to see how far the company had taken proper precautions, because it was not a sufficient answer to say that the public were not in danger. He thought at first that great blame attached to the boilermaker for not using plates of a proper thickness, but now that charge had been retracted, for he must use that term, by Dr. Church and contradicted by Riley and Mr. Horton. So if they were satisfied the boiler was constructed of the thickness ordered, Mr. Horton was as such relieved from that heavy responsibility which would have attached to him had the earlier statement been uncontradicted. Having seen with respect to the cause of the accident that the most rational view appeared to be that the plates were too thin, after hearing all the evidence, the jury proceeded to consider their decision and finally gave in the following verdict. We find that Thomas Scaife came to his death in consequence of the bursting of the boiler of a locomotive engine called the Surprise, the property of Samuel Aspinall Goddard, occasioned by the boiler being constructed of iron plates which in evidence appear of an insufficient thickness, and we attach a deodand of £60 upon the engine. The jury was then re-sworn to inquire into the death of poor Rutherford when sufficient evidence was produced to show the cause of his death. Mr. Whately again strenuously urged them to couple with the verdict an expression of their opinion in favour of the Birmingham and Gloucester Railway Company, but, as in the former case, when we understand considerable discussion took place upon this point among the jurors, the majority considered that it was no part of their duty to inquire into the conduct of the directors, and a similar verdict to the above was returned, saving that no deodand was levied. The last verdict was not given till 1 o'clock in the morning. We are happy to say that poor Paul, one of the men who was so severely scolded, is gradually recovering, and that a subscription has been opened at Bromsgrove for Mrs. Rutherford.